the shadow in the mountains. Anna had always loved the mountains. Their rugged beauty and serene landscapes were a perfect escape from her busy city life. So, when her friends suggested a weekend hike to the remote Raven's Peak, she eagerly agreed. The group consisted of Anna, her best friend Mark, his girlfriend Lisa, and their mutual friend Jake. They set off early on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The trail was steep and challenging, but they were in high spirits, laughing and chatting as they climbed higher and higher. By late afternoon, they reached a plateau that offered a stunning view of the valley below. "This is amazing," Lisa said, snapping pictures with her phone. "I can't believe we've never come up here before." Mark spread out a map on a large road. "We're making good time. The cabin should be just over that next ridge." Anna peered at the map. "Are you sure it's safe? I mean, it's pretty remote." Jake laughed. "That's the whole point. A night in an old cabin in the mountains, away from everything. It'll be fun." They continued their hike, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The air grew colder, and the forest around them seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets among themselves. By the time they reached the ridge, dusk had settled in. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, its dark silhouette stark against the twilight sky. It was an old structure, weathered and creaky, with windows that looked like vacant eyes. "This must be it," Mark said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Creepy," Lisa muttered, clutching Mark's arm. They approached the cabin, their footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. The front door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the beam of Anna's flashlight as they stepped inside. The cabin was furnished simply, a couple of old chairs, a rickety table, and a stone fireplace. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and cobwebs draped from the corners. But it was dry and relatively warm, a welcome refuge from the encroaching cold. "Home sweet home," Jake said, setting down his backpack. "I'll get a fire going." As the fire crackled to life, they settled in, unpacking their gear and preparing a simple meal. The warmth and light of the fire chased away some of the cabin's eerie atmosphere, and they began to relax. After dinner, they sat around the fire, talking and sharing stories. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and causing the cabin to creak and groan. It was then that Anna noticed something strange. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faintly, they heard it, a distant, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. "What is that?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just a branch hitting the side of the cabin," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. Anna stood up, her flashlight in hand. "I'm going to check it out." "I'll go with you," Jake said, grabbing his own flashlight. They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their faces. The wind was fierce, whipping through the trees and carrying strange, unearthly sounds. They circled the cabin, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But there was no branch, no source for the tapping. As they returned to the front, Anna spotted something on the ground. "Jake, look at this." In the dirt, just at the edge of the clearing, were footprints. But they were not normal footprints. They were elongated and misshapen, as if made by something not entirely human. "Let's get back inside," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. They hurried back into the cabin, bolting the door behind them. "Did you find anything?" Mark asked. "Footprints," Anna replied, her face pale. But they didn't look human. An uneasy silence settled over the group. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the tapping resumed, more insistent this time. "We should stick together," Mark said. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Hours passed, the tension in the cabin growing with each passing minute. Then, just after midnight, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, they thought it was over. But then, from the darkness outside, came a slow, deliberate scraping sound. It moved around the cabin, like claws dragging along the wooden walls. Lisa whimpered, clutching Mark tightly. "We need to stay calm," Jake said, though his own fear was evident. Suddenly, the scraping stopped, replaced by a heavy thud against the door. Anna's heart raced as the door shuddered under the impact. Another thud followed, and another, each one more forceful than the last. "We need to do something," Lisa cried. Jake grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle. "That should hold it." The thudding continued, the entire cabin shaking with the force. Then, without warning, the door burst open, the chair splintering under the impact. A gust of wind extinguished the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. Anna fumbled for her flashlight, the beam revealing a horrific sight. Standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Its twisted limbs and elongated fingers were covered in dark, matted fur, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. "Run!" Mark shouted, pushing Lisa toward the back of the cabin. They scrambled through the cabin, searching for an escape. The creature lunged forward, its claws raking the air. Anna grabbed the nearest object, a rusty old lantern, and swung it at the creature, buying them a few precious seconds. They reached a small window at the back, and Mark smashed it open with a chair. One by one, they crawled through the narrow opening, tumbling into the snow outside. "Keep moving," Jake urged, helping Lisa to her feet. They ran into the forest, the creature's roars echoing behind them. The trees closed in around them, the darkness thick and oppressive. They stumbled through the underbrush, driven by sheer terror. Eventually, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep ravine. They stopped, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Did we lose it?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the creature emerged from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It let out a bone-chilling howl and charged. "There!" Anna shouted, pointing to a narrow path leading down into the ravine. They scrambled down the path, the creature hot on their heels. The ground was slick with ice, and they slipped and stumbled, barely keeping their footing. At the bottom of the ravine, they found a narrow cave entrance, barely visible in the dim light. "In here," Mark said, leading the way. They squeezed into the cave, the narrow passage just wide enough for them to fit. The creature clawed at the entrance, its snarls echoing through the tunnel, but it couldn't follow them inside. They crawled deeper into the cave, the walls closing in around them. The air was cold and damp, and the darkness was absolute. Eventually, they reached a small chamber, where they collapsed in exhaustion. "We're safe," Jake said, though his voice was shaky. "At least for now." Anna nodded, her mind racing. They had survived the night, but the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And as she listened to the wind howling outside, she knew their nightmare was far from over. The haunting of Black Hollow Plains. The vast expanse of Black Hollow Plains stretched out beneath the moonlit sky, its tall grasses swaying like ghostly fingers in the night breeze. Few dared to cross these plains after dark, for they were rumored to be cursed, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead grew thin. James, Sarah, and Michael had heard the stories but dismissed them as local superstition. They were experienced hikers and had planned this trip for weeks. Their goal was to traverse Black Hollow Plains and reach the old abandoned mill on the other side before dawn. The night was unnervingly quiet as they set off, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The only sounds were the rustling of the grasses and the distant hoot of an owl. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, transforming the familiar into something strange and foreboding. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's like we're being watched." "Don't worry," James said, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes on them. "We'll be through here in a few hours. Just stick together." Michael walked a few paces ahead, scanning the horizon with his flashlight. "Look at this," he called, his voice tinged with unease. The others hurried to his side and saw what he had found. An old, weathered sign half buried in the ground. The faded letters spelled out a warning: "Beware the Watcher of the Plains." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, shivering despite herself. "It's just an old legend," James said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Come on, let's keep moving." They continued across the plain, the oppressive silence pressing down on them. After an hour, the landscape began to change. The grasses grew taller and denser, making it harder to see the path. Strange shapes seemed to move in the shadows, always just out of sight. "Did you see that?" Michael whispered, pointing to a dark figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It's just your imagination," James said, but his voice wavered. Suddenly, a chilling wind swept across the plain, carrying with it a low, mournful wail. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, a mix of sorrow and malice that sent shivers down their spines. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. "Now!" They picked up their pace, the sense of dread growing with each step. The wailing grew louder, closer, as if it were following them. James glanced back and froze. In the distance, he saw a tall, shadowy figure standing among the grasses, its eyes glowing a sickly green. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her forward. Michael was right behind them, his face pale with terror. They sprinted through the tall grasses, the shadowy figure pursuing them relentlessly. The ground beneath their feet became uneven, and they stumbled over rocks and hidden roots. The wailing was deafening now, a constant, inescapable presence. Just as they thought they couldn't run any further, they emerged from the dense grasses onto the edge of a forest. A narrow path led them down a slope to a dark, sluggish stream, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight. "We have to cross it," James panted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's our only chance." They waded into the stream, the icy water numbing their legs. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at them with unseen hands. Halfway across, Sarah screamed and pointed upstream. A figure stood on the bank, watching them with those same sickly green eyes. It raised a skeletal hand, and the wailing intensified, echoing off the trees and the water. "Keep moving," Michael shouted, pushing Sarah ahead of him. They struggled against the current, the water rising higher with each step. As they reached the far bank, the figure began to move, gliding over the surface of the stream as if it were solid ground. Panic set in, and they scrambled up the bank, falling and clawing at the muddy earth. The wailing was almost unbearable now, a chorus of the damned that seemed to seep into their very souls. They ran along the edge of the stream, the trees closing in around them. The figure was right behind them, its eyes glowing brighter, its presence a beacon of dread. Just when it seemed they could run no further, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated bridge spanning a narrower part of the stream. Without hesitation, they darted across, the wooden planks creaking ominously under their weight. As they reached the other side, the wailing abruptly stopped. They turned to see the figure standing at the edge of the bridge, unable or unwilling to cross. Its eyes dimmed, and it slowly faded into the darkness, leaving only the echo of its mournful cry. Exhausted and terrified, they collapsed on the ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest was silent once more, the stream flowing gently beside them as if nothing had happened. "We made it," James said, his voice trembling with relief. "We're safe." But as they caught their breath and looked around, they realized the forest was not the sanctuary they had hoped for. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the stream, now seeming more sinister than before, whispered dark secrets as it flowed by. They had escaped the plains, but the haunting presence lingered. The forest was its domain now, and as they huddled together on the damp earth, they knew that the terror was far from over. Somewhere in the distance, the wailing began anew, carried on the night wind, a reminder that they were never truly safe from the Watcher of the Plains. The night seemed endless as James, Sarah, and Michael sat huddled together, the eerie wail echoing through the forest. The trees closed in around them, their branches swaying ominously in the moonlight. Exhausted but unable to sleep, They listened to the stream's whispering and the distant, mournful cries. "We can't stay here," Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to find a way out." James nodded, his resolve hardening. "We need to follow the stream. It should lead us to a larger body of water or a village. We just have to keep moving." Reluctantly, they rose and began walking along the stream, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet. The only sound the soft gurgling of the water and their own footsteps crunching on the leaf-strewn ground. After what felt like hours, they came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows broken and the door hanging off its hinges. The sight of it sent a chill down their spines, but they had no other option. "Let's check it out," Michael said, trying to sound brave. "Maybe we can find some supplies or at least shelter until dawn." They approached the cabin cautiously, the floorboards creaking under their weight. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in dust. A cold draft blew through the broken windows, making the shadows dance on the walls. James moved to the fireplace and found a few logs nearby. "I'll get a fire going," he said, striking a match. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the room. Sarah found an old oil lamp and lit it, the yellow light illuminating the cabin's gloomy interior. "At least it's warmer in here," she said, though the cabin's unsettling atmosphere made her uneasy. They sat by the fire, their nerves frayed but thankful for the temporary respite. As they warmed themselves, they heard a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. They froze, their eyes darting to the source of the noise. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her grip tightening on James's arm. James nodded, rising slowly. He picked up a rusty poker from the fireplace and approached the corner cautiously. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. When he reached the corner, he saw a trapdoor hidden beneath a rotting rug. "There's something down there," James said, his voice barely audible. "Should we open it?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. "We need to know what's down there. Maybe it will give us a clue about this place." James and Michael pried the trapdoor open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the basement. A foul odor wafted up, making them gag. They exchanged a grim look before descending into the darkness, the oil lamp casting eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Old, rusted tools hung from the walls, and broken furniture was strewn about. In the far corner, they saw a large wooden crate, its lid slightly ajar. "Help me with this," James said, and together they lifted the lid. Inside the crate were old, tattered books and papers. As they sifted through the contents, they found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. James opened it, and they gathered around the lamp to read. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Blackwood, who had lived in the cabin many years ago. His entries spoke of strange occurrences in the plains and the forest, sightings of a shadowy figure with glowing green eyes, eerie wails in the night, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. Elias wrote of a dark entity that haunted the plains and the stream, an ancient spirit known as the Watcher. It fed on fear and despair, luring travelers to their doom. He had tried to banish it using ancient rituals, but his efforts had failed. The last entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness and a warning to anyone who might find the journal. "The Watcher cannot be defeated. Flee while you still can." As they finished reading, the temperature in the basement dropped suddenly. A chilling breeze blew through the room, extinguishing the lamp. They stood in complete darkness, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut above them, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs. The Watcher was coming. They scrambled up the stairs, but the door wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Desperation set in as the footsteps grew louder, closer. James grabbed the poker and began pounding on the door. "Help us! Someone, please!" The door finally gave way, and they burst into the cabin, their hearts pounding. The Watcher stood in the doorway, its glowing eyes filled with malevolence. They stepped inside, its twisted form blocking their escape. "We have to fight it," Michael said, grabbing a broken chair leg. "It's our only chance." They stood their ground, their makeshift weapons at the ready. The Watcher lunged at them, its claws slashing through the air. They fought back with everything they had, but the entity seemed impervious to their attacks. Just as all hope seemed lost, Sarah remembered something she had read in Elias's journal. A passage about a sacred stream that could purify and banish dark spirits. It was their only chance. "To the stream!" she shouted. "It's our only hope." They ran out of the cabin, the Watcher close behind. The forest was a blur as they sprinted through the trees, the stream's distant gurgling their only guide. The wails of the Watcher grew louder, more furious, as it pursued them relentlessly. They reached the stream just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The water shimmered with an otherworldly light, casting a protective glow. Without hesitation, they plunged into the stream, the cold water shocking their senses. The Watcher stopped at the edge of the stream, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Couldn't cross the water. It let out a final, ear-piercing wail before dissolving into the shadows, vanquished by the stream's purifying power. They crawled out of the water, exhausted but alive. The forest was still and silent, the oppressive presence of the Watcher finally gone. As the morning sun rose, they made their way back to the plains, grateful to have survived the night. The haunting of Black Hollow Plains was over, but the memory of that night would stay with them forever. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. And as they left the cursed plains behind, they knew they would never forget the terror of the Watcher and the narrow escape by the sacred stream.